They say the moon bled that night, not in myth, not in fear, but in memory. Long before European boots scarred the red sands of Namibia, there stood a proud people, the Himba, covered in ochre-red clay, wrapped in goat hide, and crowned in braids as thick as history itself. They lived not just in the desert, they were the desert. Their footsteps echoed across dry riverbeds like old chants, whispered into the bones of dead trees. The north winds of Kayakoland carried the voices of elders. Around sacred fire pits, they spoke of the gods of sand and stars, of ancestors buried in stone circles, and of oaths made beneath eclipsed moons. The Himba didn't build empires of stone or carve kingdoms into maps. They built legacy in blood, in dust, and in ritual. But peace in the land of red earth never lasts long. Far beyond the dunes, rumors spread, whispers of white-skinned ghosts, riding steel ships, bringing fire sticks and silver tongues. Men who didn't understand land as spirit, but measured it in miles and profit. At first, they came with trinkets, mirrors, knives, cloth dyed in strange colors. They smiled wide, learned tribal greetings, and bowed at council circles. But soon, they stopped bowing. The year was 1904. The Herero tribes to the south had already been struck by thunder and lead. German soldiers, colonizers, were now hungry for the northern frontier. The Himba, still untouched, watched the dust rise on the horizon. Among them stood King Tchapuka, the last flame of the lion-blooded line. Tall, wrapped in leopard skin, his eyes dark like storm clouds, and his voice like cracking wood in fire. He had seen the future in a dream. A moon drowned in blood, children crying with ash in their mouths, and warriors without graves. He knew something was coming, and he would not let his people die quietly. The elders gathered beneath the Okaruo, the sacred fire that had never gone out for centuries. Its smoke was said to carry messages to the ancestors, and now it was thick with warning. Cattle herders had seen strangers in the south, men in iron buttons and tall hats, riding beasts that thundered like stampedes but left no hoof prints, wagons powered by smoke and steel. King Tchapuka stood in silence, watching the fire sway. Around him sat the old voices, Chief Omungwa of the western dunes, old Mai Congo from the salt fields, and young Waru, the fire-blooded warrior who had never seen fear. The air was heavy with incense and dread. "They've taken the Herero," Omungwa whispered, his voice gravelly. "Slaughtered them by the thousands. Drive the rest into the desert without food, without water." Waru clenched his jaw. "We are not the Herero." "No," Mai Congo replied bitterly. "We are next." Tchapuka raised his hand. Silence spread like a cloak. "We are the Red Earth," he said. "We do not kneel. Not to kings, not to gods, and not to ghosts who come in ships." But war had already begun long before the first bullet would fly. In the nearby settlement of Achitambi, missionaries had arrived. They brought strange books and softer words. Some Himba were drawn, not by faith, but by flour, sugar, and salt, a taste of the foreign world. One by one, cracks formed in the tribe. Sons questioning old ways. Women trading ochre for cotton. And worse, whispers of some chiefs making secret pacts with the white men for power. Tchapuka knew what betrayal smelled like. It reeked of smoke, not from the sacred fire, but from burnt villages. The king ordered the horns blown. All warriors, even the old and scarred, were summoned. Not for battle, not yet, but for a journey. They would ride to Okakarara, to the border of the Herero slaughter fields, to see what had become of those who once ruled their valleys. They rode at dusk, a line of ochre-painted warriors, spears in hand, eyes forward, drums echoing against canyon walls. And what they found broke the sky. At the edge of the desert basin near Okakarara, silence ruled like a tyrant. There were no songs, no herds, no wind, only bones scattered like broken promises. Ribcages half buried in sand, skulls cracked open as if the sky itself had stomped them. Charred spears, snapped bracelets, and torn leather cloaks littered the red ground. Buzzards circled overhead, but even they seemed hesitant to land. Tchapuka dismounted slowly. He knelt near the blackened remains of what had once been a Herero homestead. The clay hut collapsed. The family it held long turned to ash. His fingers touched the dirt. It was warm, not from the sun, but from memory. Behind him, Waru stared in horror. They didn't just kill, he whispered. They erased them. It was true. The Germans had not fought a war. They had committed a cleansing. Entire villages starved, poisoned, gunned down near wells. Men were shot. Women were violated. Children were chased into the desert and left for the vultures. And now, they were marching north. By the third night of their scouting journey, the Himba war party camped beside a dry riverbed. The sky above stretched like an endless wound, stars blinking like the eyes of old spirits. Around the campfire, silence choked them. But Chipuka stood. In his hand, he held a pouch. From it, he pulled out the red ochre and smeared it across his chest, not for beauty, not for tradition, but for war. The ochre meant life. It meant blood. It meant the land still recognized its sons. They think we are dust, he said, voice echoing through stone and flame. They think we will vanish like the Herero. But they forget. We were warriors before they built their first ships. We are the voice of the fire. And the fire is not afraid. The men began to chant, low at first, then rising like a storm. Spears tapped against drums. Anklets rattled. Eyes burned red beneath the night. It was then, beneath a crescent moon, that a scout came running from the south. Breathless, bleeding, terrified. They're here, he gasped. White men. Guns. Hundreds. Building a fort near the Epupa Falls. And, he paused, shaking. One of our own is with them. The name fell from the scout's mouth like a curse. Makuro. Gasps. Then silence. Even the fire seemed to recoil. Makuro, once the blood brother of King Chipuka, born of the same stars, raised under the same baobab tree. A warrior of the Himba, trained in spear, song, and silence. Years ago, he had vanished after a bitter feud over the elders' refusal to accept foreign guns. Rumor said he had crossed the river into the arms of the white ghosts. Now, the rumor has become fact. A Himba warrior siding with the enemy, not as a slave, not as a servant, but as a guide. A traitor. Chipuka's jaw tightened. He knows our paths, our sacred wells, our hiding grounds. My Congo hissed. He'll lead them straight to our heart. The council broke into argument. Some called for retreat, others for diplomacy. But Waru, his fists clenched and eyes burning, stood firm. We ride to the falls, he said. We see it with our own eyes. If the traitor walks among the invaders, then let his blood feed the river. Chipuka nodded once. By the next dawn, the warriors rode through narrow canyons and across cracked plains, trailing the river like a black vein through the earth. They moved like shadows, silent, fast, wrapped in ochre and ash. 3 days later, from a ridge above Epupa Falls, they saw it. The land had been violated. Where once the river sang to the rocks, now chimneys choked the sky with smoke. German flags flapped above a crude timber fort. Tents lined the banks. Soldiers moved like ants, patrolling, drinking, building death. And among them, walking proudly in a foreign coat, was Makuro. He was draped in leather, a gun slung over his shoulder. His long Himba braids now shaved short like the Europeans. But his face still held the same scar across the brow, earned when he and Chipuka had fought side by side against the jackals of the southern valley. Now, he stood beside the enemy, laughing, watching, pointing toward the hills. Waru spit on the ground. He's marked us. Chipuka lowered his eyes. Then we mark him back. That night, the Himba warriors melted into the trees like ghosts of their ancestors. They moved with the wind, barefoot, silent, painted in ash to hide the red of their skin. Each man carried a blade dipped in poison from the desert scorpion, each step chosen by the spirits of old. The fort at Epupa was not a fortress of steel. It was arrogance wrapped in timber and ignorance. The Germans believed no one would dare attack them so deep in the north. Their guards were lax. Their fires are too high. Their backs are too open. The Himba attacked just before moonrise. It wasn't a battle, it was a lesson. From the darkness came whistles, sharp and bird-like, the signal of the hunt. Then, chaos. Spears flew like whispers of death. Throats were cut before voices could rise. Tents collapsed under fire. Gunmen reached for rifles that had already been taken. Horses screamed. Men ran into their own blades. War moved like a storm unleashed, cutting, stabbing, vanishing. Ma Congo, though old, stood atop a wagon, hurling burning coals into the enemy tents. Japuka? He walked straight into the heart of the camp, eyes locked onto one man. Makuro. The traitor stood amidst the smoke, gun in hand, and froze when he saw his brother. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Two men, once friends, now echoes, stared through the firelight. Makuro, Japuka said low. Why? Makuro didn't answer. His hand tightened on the gun. You were Himba. Japuka continued. You were my brother. Makuro raised the gun, but Japuka had already moved. The blade sang once, and Makuro fell, not like a warrior, but like a shadow stripped of its body. The battle ended in less than an hour. By dawn, the fort was ash. German bodies lay scattered among broken crates and shattered mirrors. The river ran red for miles. But the war had only just begun. The survivors would return, not just with more men, but with machines. With vengeance. Japuka stood atop the ruined gate, eyes fixed southward. The moon will bleed again, he whispered. And when it does, so will we. The smoke of the fallen fort lingered for days, curling into the heavens like the breath of a dying god. Word spread fast, not just among the colonizers, but across the scattered tribes of Namibia. Some cheered in secret. Others trembled. To strike the Germans was to summon a beast, and the Himba had summoned it with fire. From Windhoek, the German command sent their reply. Not with letters, not with threats, but with columns of soldiers. Uniformed men, their rifles gleaming, their boots stomping centuries of soil into dust. They came with Maxim guns, with supply caravans, with horses trained for desert terrain. And they brought something far worse than weapons, maps. Maps drawn by Makuro before his death. Maps that showed sacred valleys, hidden springs, and burial grounds. Japuka knew the bloodshed at Epupa had bought them no freedom, only time. But time was sacred. Time was breath. The Himba began to vanish. Villages disappeared into the rocks. Paths were scrubbed clean. Fires no longer smoked in the day. The people became shadows, blending into the land as they had always done. But this time, they weren't running to hide. They were preparing. Deep in the Ongongo caves, the warriors trained. New spears were sharpened. Ash was mixed with crushed bone for war paint. Women sang to the unborn to remind them of the bloodline they came from. Children learned silence, the kind that could save a soul in the jungle. And in the heart of it all, Japuka sat before the oldest tree in the valley. Its bark was burned in places, carved with names of kings long gone. He placed his palm against it and whispered an oath, one only the earth would hear. If we fall as one. But we will not be forgotten. Let our blood write the story the white man cannot erase. But the enemy moved faster than even spirits predicted. Within weeks, the Germans reached the banks of the Kanena River. And this time, they didn't stop at conquest. They brought torches. Whole settlements, empty though they were burned to ash. Sacred stones shattered. Wells poisoned. Graves desecrated. The land screamed, and the Himba heard. It was no longer about land. It was no longer even about survival. It had become a war of memory. Rain had not touched the Himba land in many moons. The cracked earth split open like an old wound, thirsting for something it could not name. But the people, they no longer prayed for rain. They prayed for justice. The council gathered in a hidden gorge where red cliffs towered like sleeping gods. Around the fire, warriors painted each other's bodies, not with beauty, but with symbols. Each stroke told a story, a lost brother, a burned village, a sacred animal slaughtered. Waru stepped forward, his chest bare, a jagged scar glowing beneath the ochre. Let them come, he said. Let them bring all their guns, their horses, their fire. The desert does not fear fire, it becomes it. Elder Ma Congo stood with effort, leaning on his staff carved with hyena teeth. "The Germans do not fight like men," he rasped. "They poison water. They kill children in their sleep. They erase names." Japuka stared into the fire. "Then we give them something they cannot erase." He lifted a clay pot sealed for generations. Within it, ashes of the first Himba king. With solemn reverence, he smeared the ashes across his chest, down his arms, over his eyes. "I wear the past," he said. "I carry the blood of those who first walked these sands. Let this be our story, even if none of us survive to tell it." The plan was brutal, not a battle, but a trap. The Germans, arrogant from their swift advance, were following paths marked by their stolen maps. They believed the Himba were retreating. They did not see what the Himba saw. They did not know the land had memory. At Ajiwano Gorge, narrow and winding, the Germans would march in single file. On one side, towering cliffs. On the other, jagged rockfall and death. It was there the Himba would strike. They placed boulders overhead, bound by vines and prayers. Spears hidden in thorn bushes. Warriors buried in shallow pits, painted to vanish. The jungle held its breath. Then came the thunder of boots. The sound of marching boots echoed through the gorge like a heartbeat of doom. German soldiers filed into Ajiwano Gorge in tight columns, confident, loud, armored in arrogance. Their uniforms were clean. Their rifles glinted beneath the morning sun. Scouts rode ahead on horseback, scanning for movement, unaware that the stones themselves had eyes. Above them, Himba warriors lay hidden behind rocks, every breath held like sacred smoke. Below, the dry gorge twisted into a trap shaped by gods. The first line of German troops entered the kill zone. Japuka gave no signal, the land did. A sudden gust swept through the gorge, lifting sand like a veil. In that moment of blindness, Waru let out a cry, a deep, guttural roar from the old tongue. The cliffs answered. Boulders rolled from above, smashing men and horses alike. Spears rained from the sky. The thorn bushes exploded as warriors leapt out, blades flashing in the sun. The enemy's screams mingled with war chants, turning the gorge into a storm of blood and dust. German officers tried to regroup, shouting orders, but the narrow terrain betrayed them. Their rifles jammed with sand. Horses panicked and trampled their own riders. Men slipped on rocks slick with blood. Some tried to climb the cliffs, only to be met with Himba blades. Japuka fought like a spirit returned from the grave. His spear danced through enemy lines, never stopping, never hesitating. He bore no armor, only ochre and ash, but the bullets seemed to miss him as if the ancestors shielded his steps. Waru tore through the ranks, his war cry echoing down the gorge like thunder on bone. He fought with both hands, both hearts, the one he was born with, and the one broken when his village was burned. By the time the sun reached its peak, the gorge was silent again. Over 120 German soldiers lay dead. The few survivors had fled, broken, bloodied, their flags torn and their pride left behind with the corpses. The Himba gathered the fallen weapons, supplies, and ammunition. They left the bodies for the vultures, a warning to any who dared follow. That night, the fires burned higher than they had in generations. But no one danced, because they knew victory always invites vengeance. 2 weeks passed, but peace never came. The Himba knew better. What they had done in Ajiwano Gorge would not be forgiven. Not by the Germans. Not by the colonial crown sitting thousands of miles away, furious that a desert tribe had crushed one of their battalions. From Windhoek, a telegram was sent. A single word, annihilate. And so they came. Not dozens, but hundreds. Columns of German soldiers, mercenaries, and colonial auxiliaries. They marched with wagons filled with artillery, bringing with them hell forged in European factories. Gatling guns, mortar cannons, kerosene tanks. Their uniforms were darker now, not polished, but hardened by orders soaked in hate. Leading them was a new face, Colonel Wilhelm Steinmann, a brutal man who had overseen the Herero genocide. He had razed villages, poisoned wells, even built camps where starvation was weaponized. Now he marched north to finish the Himba. But this time, he came with something worse than guns. He brought prisoners. captured Himba women and children, torn from outlying homesteads, chained and bleeding. They were dragged at the front of the German line, human shields against an invisible enemy. When the Himba scouts reported this to Chipuka, the silence was unbearable. No war drum sounded. No blade was lifted. He stood beneath the moon that night, a swollen red circle rising above the hills, and he spoke not to his warriors, but to the earth. "You test me," he whispered to the ancestors. "You test what it means to be king." My Congo approached, his face hollowed with grief. "We can't strike while they hold our blood in chains." War snarled. "And if we don't, they'll burn everything anyway." Chipuka stared into the fire for a long time. Then he said, "Then we split the fire." The plan that formed was desperate and sacred. Half the warriors would stay hidden in the cliffs of Ojimboro Pass, prepared for a second ambush. The other half would follow Chipuka into the enemy's shadow, not to fight, but to bargain. A king, unarmed, walking into the lion's mouth. The dawn came with no birdsong. Even the wind held its breath. Chipuka walked alone. His body was painted not for war, but for death, streaks of white ash, drawn like ribs over his chest, symbolizing his readiness to pass into the spirit world. In his hands, he carried no spear, no shield, only a staff carved with the names of kings before him. The German camp sprawled across the flat basin beyond the river. Soldiers moved like insects, building barricades, digging trenches. Cannons faced the cliffs, and at the very front, staked into the dust, were the prisoners, Himba women, elders, and crying children. They were chained to wooden poles like livestock. As Chipuka approached, guns were immediately raised. "Stop there," a soldier barked in German. Chipuka didn't flinch. From the center tent, Colonel Wilhelm Steinmann emerged, tall, sharp-featured, his face untouched by dust. He stared at the lone figure walking toward him and narrowed his eyes. "You are the king," he said in broken Ajaharero. Chipuka stopped 10 paces from him. "I am what the land made me." The colonel smirked. "And you come alone?" "Unarmed. I come to speak." Steinmann's eyes scanned the horizon, expecting a trap. But there was none. Only the silence of a people on the edge of extinction. "You killed my men," he said. "They came to burn." Chipuka replied. "They came to civilization. They came to erase." The colonel stepped closer. "You're a fool. This land will be German. These people, your people, will serve, or they will vanish. I am offering you mercy. Bow now, bend your knee, and your tribe may live. Resist, and I will turn your bones to dust." Chipuka looked at the chained children, their eyes wide with hunger and hope. Then he looked at the colonel, and he did something no one expected. He knelt. Steinmann laughed. "So the savage learns." But Chipuka didn't lower his head. He raised his voice, and in the ancient tongue of the fire pits, he shouted one word. "Now." The cliffs exploded. The explosion shattered the morning sky. Rocks, fire, and smoke cascaded from the cliffs above the German camp. Hidden within those very cliffs, Himba warriors had planted kegs of black powder stolen from an old mission outpost weeks earlier. It was their last secret, their final act of defiance. The avalanche buried the front line of cannons, crushed 2 supply wagons, and sent German soldiers into chaos. Colonel Steinmann staggered back, blood running down his temple, shouting orders no one could hear through the thunder of falling stone. And amidst the confusion, the real war began. From behind boulders and dried ravines, the Himba charged. They were few, barely 100 men and women, but they fought with the fury of ancestors whispering through their bones. Spears met rifles. Stones shattered skulls. Fire arrows lit the enemy's food stores, and wild cattle, released from the corral, stampeded through tents. Chipuka rose from his kneeling position, snatched a fallen rifle, and ran straight into the fray. He moved like a shadow, ducking, weaving, striking. Beside him, his son Kavik fought with a double-headed axe carved from sacred wood. Beside Kavik, even the young and the old had taken up arms, mothers with knives, elders with clubs. The battle was a scream. The prisoners, inspired by the uprising, pulled at their chains, broke free, and joined the fight. The Himba, once cornered, once beaten, had become a storm. But the Germans were trained, disciplined, and well-armed. For every soldier that fell, another took his place. Machine guns mounted behind the fallen front line began to mow down the advancing Himba. Blood turned the dust to mud. Kavik was shot through the shoulder and dropped, gasping. Japuka reached him, pulling him behind a burnt cart, pressing down on the wound. His hands shook, not from fear, but from knowing the end was close. Still, he whispered, "Don't let them take the memory. Even if we fall, we do not vanish." Above them, the moon began to rise, red as rust. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the battlefield smoldered. Fires flickered in every corner of the valley, from burning tents to shattered carts. The cries of the wounded echoed through the smoke. The Himba had retreated into the crevices of the rocks, carrying their injured and whatever supplies they could salvage. Japuka, covered in blood that was not only his own, climbed higher with Kavik slung across his back. They reached a cave system the elders once used for rituals, a sacred hollow hidden by time and legend. Here, the remaining fighters gathered. Barely 60 had survived the assault. Half of them were wounded. All were exhausted. Yet no one wept. Japuka stood before them, eyes hollow, chest heaving. "Tonight," he said hoarsely, "we sing for those who went into the earth as warriors. Tomorrow, we decide what remains of our people." An old woman named Konajik, blind but wise, stepped forward. "I dreamed of this war before your mother birthed you. The gods said the moon would bleed. And it has." Outside, the moon loomed low and dark red, cloaked by the ash in the sky. It looked like an omen, or perhaps a morning eye in the heavens. The Germans, meanwhile, regrouped in the valley. Colonel Steinman had survived, limping, livid. 2 of his lieutenants were dead. Nearly 40 men had been lost. Their cannons were buried under stone. Supplies were running thin. And now, the Himba had vanished into the cliffs. He knew the fight wasn't over. "They will starve or surrender," he growled. But he underestimated the Himba's bond with the land. They knew every crevice, every stream hidden beneath dry earth. They knew how to vanish, and more importantly, how to endure. Japuka watched the fires below from a narrow ledge. He whispered, "This land will not remember your names, Colonel, but it will remember ours." Dawn broke without light. The valley was cloaked in a thick veil of ash. The air was dry and poisonous. The scent of charred wood and blood still hung heavy. But in the shadows of the mountains, the Himba had begun to stir. In the sacred caves, a silent ritual had started. Konajik, the blind elder, painted symbols across the warriors' chests using ochre and goat blood. These were not symbols of revenge, but of remembrance. Each mark represented an ancestor, a fallen child, or a forgotten name. The cave walls pulsed with the sound of low humming, not songs of victory, but ancient echoes of resilience. Kavik, though badly wounded, lay propped against a stone. He clasped Japuka's hand and whispered, "If we die, let us not vanish. Let our stories be heavier than the boots of any empire." Japuka nodded. His face was carved in stone now, emotion buried under duty. He ordered the survivors to split into 4 groups, each to scatter in different directions across the mountain, carrying children, scrolls, and memory. They would not all survive. But survival wasn't the goal. Survival was a strategy. Memory was the war. Far below, the Germans readied for a final push. Colonel Steinman had sent word for reinforcements, but his pride would not allow retreat. He planned to scale the cliffs with ropes and dynamite, flushing the Himba out like rats. But as the sun climbed, the cliffs themselves began to speak. Rocks tumbled without warning. Fires erupted where there were no torches. Traps, buried decades ago by forgotten hands, sprang to life. Men screamed as spears burst from crevices. Boulders rolled without touch. The mountains were alive. Or perhaps, the Himba had simply become part of them. It was no longer a war. It was a haunting. By mid-morning, the cliffs ran red again. The German forces, once organized, clean, and machine-like, had descended into disarray. Their boots slipped on blood-slicked rock, their rifles jammed from the dust, and their morale cracked like the bones beneath their feet. Colonel Steinman barked orders that echoed against empty stone. Half his men had vanished into the smoke. Screams echoed from invisible ledges. Every bush, every crevice, every gust of wind now felt like it carried a whisper of Himba ghosts. It was Chapuka's design. He had studied these cliffs since boyhood. He knew the rhythm of falling stones, the silent paths between shadows, the places where goats refused to tread. Now, his warriors used that knowledge as a weapon. One by one, German soldiers were lured into narrow passes and swallowed whole. But it was not without cost. Konajik, the blind elder, was among the first to fall. He had refused to flee. With only a carved staff in hand, he stood in the mouth of the cave, chanting the names of the ancestors as bullets tore through his chest. He died standing, his body refusing to kneel even in death. Children cried silently in their mother's arms, hidden in hollowed trees. A young girl named Kapindu watched her brother die from a stray bayonet as he shielded her. She did not scream. She only buried his necklace in the dirt and crawled deeper into the earth. And amid the carnage, Kavik, wounded but unyielding, climbed to the highest ridge. He tied his body to the rock, not for defense, but as a message. Wrapped in Himba red, with streaks of blood across his face, he raised his arm and screamed in Ajaharero, "We are the stone, and stone does not run." The mountains answered. A roar rose from the Himba, still hidden. Spears were flung from unseen places. Drums, how they survived, no one knew, boomed through the canyons like thunder from the bones of the gods. The colonel's men fled, not because they were losing, but because they had realized they were never fighting men. They were fighting memories. The following day, silence reigned over the cliffs. Smoke curled lazily from smoldering branches. Bodies, German and Himba alike, lay twisted among the rocks, marked not just by wounds but by the brutality of belief. This was not a battlefield. It was a grave etched in fire and legacy. Chapuka moved through the haze like a shadow. His arm hung limp, pierced by shrapnel, but he walked upright. His eyes searched for the living, not the dead. At the foot of the sacred ridge, he found her, Adjair, the firekeeper's daughter. She was kneeling beside her brother's body, her red ochre smeared with ash. She looked up at the war chief, eyes hollow, lips trembling. "Did we win?" she asked. Chapuka did not answer. Victory meant nothing when the bones of your blood kin littered the earth, when children no longer laughed, when the elders sang no more. Instead, he knelt beside her and gently placed her brother's broken spear across his chest. Then he began the death song, one of the oldest, taught to him by his grandfather under starlight. Soon, more voices joined, ragged, weak, but defiant. It was not just mourning. It was a warning. Far below, Colonel Steinman regrouped with what was left of his battalion. He had lost half his men in a single day, not to superior firepower, but to a people who refused to be erased. He lit a cigar with trembling fingers. "The Himba are not a tribe," he muttered to his aide. "They are the land itself." The aide didn't reply. He had seen a soldier die after being struck by a child with a sharpened bone. He'd seen warriors emerge from behind boulders like spirits, their faces painted with ash and war oil, chanting songs older than any European map. They had come to conquer soil. Instead, they had awakened gods. Weeks passed, but the air in Kayako land never fully cleared. The Himba who survived returned to their kraals with wounds deeper than flesh. The elders said the land had changed. The spirits had tasted war again, and they were restless. The skies refused to rain. The cattle grew lean. The moon remained red for 3 cycles. But the people did not break. Chapuka, though grievously injured, did not rest. Every night, he walked the outer edges of the villages, inspecting the stars, listening to the wind. He was searching, not for enemies, but for the voice of his ancestors. And one night it came. By the sacred baobab tree, the wind changed. The leaves trembled with whispers older than time. Chapuka fell to his knees and closed his eyes. The voice of Chief Matambo, the old king, came not as words but as memory, firelight, chanting, the smell of dung smoke and ochre. You bled to protect the bones of our fathers, it said. But now you must protect their memory. Chipuka rose slowly. The next morning, he gathered the remaining Himba chiefs. We cannot win this war with spears alone, he said. We must win it with story, with silence, with survival. The elders nodded. And so, a decision was made. The Himba would vanish, not in defeat, but in strategy. They would scatter into smaller clans, deeper into the desert, into the mountains, into places the white men could never map. They would take their drums, their songs, their sacred red ochre, and disappear like smoke. But they would remember. They would teach their children the names of the hills, the taste of rain before it fell, the story of the day the moon bled and the sand drank war. And someday, when the land healed, when the ancestors stirred again, they would return, not as warriors, but as storms. Years passed. The colonial forts crumbled under their own rust. Roads were laid and abandoned. New wars came, faraway ones, with rifles and helicopters. But the Himba were no longer part of them. They had vanished from maps, from books, from worry. Yet they endured. In the deep deserts of Kayakoland, where only wind dared speak, fires still crackled in circles of red clay and smoke. Children with ochre-coated skin danced around flames, their chants echoing into the emptiness like memory reborn. The Himba never forgot the War of the Moon. They passed it on, in riddles, in rhythm, in the flicker of flame on skin. The tale of Chipuka, the last war chief. Of Kanuhi's defiance. At night the Portuguese bled into the earth. The legend was never written, it was sung. And when scholars, years later, came to study the tribe, they were confused. These people should have vanished, they said. But they did not. They couldn't understand the reason. It was not a weapon, not numbers. It was a memory. It was silent. It was resistance in the form of patience. And in one remote crawl, an elder woman traced the red dye across her grandchild's face and whispered, "Long ago, the moon bled." But we did not. A distant drumbeat answered her words from across the dunes. The Himba were still here. And perhaps, someday, when the land called them again, when justice demanded an old name spoken into new air, the last kings would rise, not in war, but in flame and thunder, with ancestors behind them. Because no true tribe dies. It only waits.